So we come to the first featherweight boxing title history video. Just have a little run through. So the first division I started watching as a kid, Barry McGuigan. It was a featherweight. Yeah, good division. The featherweight class first came active in the prize ring around 1860, but did not gain widespread acceptance until the Irishman with the English name, Ike Weir, fought the Englishman with the Irish name, Frank Murphy, to a draw in 1889. It's about 80, yeah, it was 80 rounds that. So Weir was generally considered to be getting on top when the police intervened, like they used to, and like the bare knuckle fights also. But when he got a second chance at the title, he was knocked out by Torpedo Billy Murphy of New Zealand. There was at this time a wide gap between the division's limits in Britain and America. The British regarded it as being somewhere or anywhere from 122 to 126 pounds, while the Americans favoured 112 to 114. The pick of the early champions was George Dixon, the black Canadian, who was known as Little Chocolate. I think he started about 6 stone, nearly 6 stone when he started his career. That guy, 6.5 stone, something like that. So he was always giving away weight, no matter what division he was in. First man to invent shadow boxing, so they reckon. Good pioneer of the game and great fighter. So he was responsible for moving the American limit first to 117 and then 120 pounds and then 122 pounds. It was not until 1920 when the Americans accepted the British figure of 126 pounds, at which it has remained all this time. As the list below, the story of the heavyweight class is complicated, with the title frequently in dispute. That is still the case. The last time there was just one champion was almost 30 years ago in 1967, but the featherweights have always had a place in the public's affections, and champions of the quality of Willie Pep, Eusebio Pedrosa, Sandy Sadler, Salvador Sanchez, stand pound for pound by comparison as some of the best. Like, yeah, Willie Pep's definitely in my top 10 pound for pound. So, World Featherweight Championship bouts. March the 31st, 1889, Ike Weir from Ireland draws with Frank Murphy from England over 80 rounds in counts. And January 13th, 1890, Billy Murphy from New Zealand wins by KO against Ike Weir in the 14th round in San Francisco. Then September the 2nd, 1890, young Griffo from Australia wins over 15 rounds. Referee stops the fight against Billy Murphy in Sydney, Australia. Griffo outgrew the division. July 27th, 1892, George Dixon from Canada wins by KO in the 14th round against Fred Johnston from England in Coney Island. Then September the 6th, 1892, George Dixon wins by KO in the 8th round against Jack Skelly from the US in New Orleans. August the 7th, 1893, George Dixon wins by KO in the 3rd round against Eddie Pierce from the US in Coney Island. September the 25th, 1893, George Dixon wins by KO in the 7th round against Solly Smith from the US in Coney Island. June 29th, 1894, George Dixon draws over 20 rounds against young Griffo. Boston, Massachusetts, November the 27th, 1896. Frankie Earn from the US wins on points over 20 rounds against George Dixon in New York. Then March 24th, 1897, George Dixon wins on points over 25 rounds against Frankie Earn in New York. Then October 4th, 1897, Solly Smith from the US wins on points over 20 rounds against George Dixon from Canada. That's in San Francisco. So, George Dixon was argued that as Smith was £2 over the agreed weight of £118, the title was not at stake. Smith was widely regarded as the new champion, but in Britain a rival version of the championship limit of £122 was claimed by Ben Jordan of Bermondsey, London, who outpointed Dixon over 25 rounds in New York on July the 1st, 1898. So, August the 1st, 1898, Solly Smith draws over 25 rounds against Tommy White from the US and Coney Island. Then September the 26th, 1898, Dave Sullivan from the US wins in the 5th round by retirement against Solly Smith and Coney Island. Then November 11th, 1898, George Dixon wins by disqualification over 10 rounds against Dave Sullivan in New York. Then November the 29th, 1898, George Dixon wins on points over 25 rounds against Oscar Gardner from the US in New York. Then January the 17th, 1899, George Dixon wins by KO in 10 rounds against young Pluto from Australia in New York. Then May the 29th, 1899, Ben Jordan from England wins by KO in the 9th round against Harry Greenfield in London, England. And then October the 10th, 1899, Eddie Santry wins by KO in the 15th round against Ben Jordan in New York. The above two were for the British version of the title. So, March the 9th, 1900. November the 2nd, 1899. George Dixon wins on points over 25 rounds against Will Curley from England in New York. 25 rounds points decision. November 21st, 1899. George Dixon wins on points over 25 rounds against Eddie Lenny from the US in New York. And then January 9th, 1900. Terry McGovern from the US wins in the 8th round. Referee stops the fight against George Dixon, New York. February 1st, 1900, Terry McGovern wins by KO in the 5th round against Eddie Santry from the US in Chicago, Illinois for the undisputed title. Then March the 9th, 1900, Terry McGovern wins by KO in the 3rd round against Oscar Gardner in New York. November the 2nd, 1900, Terry McGovern wins by KO in the 7th round against Joe Bernstein from the US in Louisville, Kentucky. Then November 28th, 1901, George Corbett II from the US wins by KO in the 2nd round against Terry McGovern from Hartford, Connecticut. Then Corbett could no longer make the championship limit, and Abertel, who had drawn with and beaten George Dixon in 1901, was regarded as the best man at the weight. September 3rd, 1903, Abertel from the US wins on points over 25 rounds against Johnny Regan from the US in St. Louis, Missouri. Then February the 1st, 1904, Abertel wins by KO in the 5th round against Harry Forbes from the US in St. Louis, Missouri. And then February 22nd, 1906, Abertale wins on points over 15 rounds against Jimmy Walsh from the US in Chelsea, Massachusetts. May 11th, 1906, Abertale draws over 20 rounds against Kid Herman from the US in Los Angeles. Then July the 4th, 1906, Abertale wins on points over 20 rounds against Frankie Neal from the US in Los Angeles. Then October the 30th, 1906, Abertale wins on points over 20 rounds against Harry Baker from the US in Los Angeles. Then November the 16th, 1906, Abertale wins on points over 15 rounds against Billy D. Kersey from the US. 15 rounds points decision in San Diego. Then December the 7th, 1906, Abertale wins in the 8th round by KO against Jimmy Walsh from Los Angeles. January the 18th, 1907, Abertale wins by KO in the 8th round against Harry Baker at Los Angeles. Lovely. So, May the 24th, 1907, Abertale wins on points over 20 rounds against Kid Solomon from the US in Los Angeles. October the 29th, 1907, Abertale wins by KO in the 4th round against Freddie Weeks from the US in Los Angeles. Then January the 1st, 1908, Abertale draws over 25 rounds against Owen Moran in England in San Francisco. Then January 31st, 1908, Abertale wins in the 13th round by retirement against Frankie Neal, San Francisco. Then February 28th, 1908, Abertale wins in the 7th round, referee stops the fight against Eddie Kelly from the US in San Francisco. Then September the 7th, 1908, Abertale draws over 23 rounds against Owen Moran, San Francisco. I think I've gone through this. February 28th, 1908, that's when Jack Johnson won his heavyweight title. Abertale beats Eddie Kelly from the US in San Francisco. And then September the 7th, 1908, Abertale draws with Owen Moran from Birmingham, England. 23 rounds, San Francisco. December 29th, 1908, Abertale wins by KO in the 8th round against Biz Mackey from the US in New Orleans. Then January the 14th, 1908, Abertale wins by KO in the 10th round against Freddie Weeks. That's in Goldfield. February the 4th, 1909, Abertale wins by retirement in the 7th round against Eddie Kelly in New Orleans. Then February the 19th, 1909, Jim DeScroll from Wales gets a no decision against Abertale in New York. DeScroll was clearly the better man, but Attell refused to give him a rematch for the championship. However, on the basis of his performance, DeScroll was recognised as world champion by Britain and the IBU. October the 24th, 1910, Abertale wins on points over 10 rounds against Johnny Kilbane from the US in Kansas City. Then February 22nd, 1912, Johnny Kilbane wins on points over 20 rounds against Abertale in Vernon. Then June the 3rd, 1912, Jim DeScroll wins by KO in the 12th round against Jean Posey from France in London, England. January 27th, 1913, Jim DeScroll draws over 20 rounds against Owen Moran from Birmingham, England in London, England. Then February 1913, Jim DeScroll retires. So, April the 29th, 1913, Johnny Kilbane draws over 20 rounds with Johnny Dundee from the US in Los Angeles. Then September the 6th, 1913, Johnny Kilbane wins on points over 12 rounds against Jimmy Walsh in Boston, Massachusetts. Then September the 4th, 1916, Johnny Kilbane wins in the 3rd round by KO against Kid Cheney from the US in Cedar Point, Ohio. September the 17th, 1921, Johnny Kilbane wins in the 7th round by KO against Danny Thrush from England, Cleveland, Ohio. That was in. The New York Commission stripped Kilbane of the title for failing to defend against Johnny Dundee and matched Dundee with Danny Frush for the vacant title. So August the 15th, 1922, Johnny Dundee wins by KO in the 9th round against Danny Frush in Brooklyn. And then June 2nd, 1923, Eugene Creaky from France wins by KO in the 6th round against Johnny Kilbane in New York. Then July 26th, 1923, Johnny Dundee wins by KO in the 6th round against Eugene Creaky in New York. For the undisputed title, Dundee relinquishes the title because of his weight problems in August 1923. Then January the 2nd, 1925, Louis Kaplan, I think it was originally like a Russian descent, from the US though here, wins by retirement in the 9th round against Danny Kramer from the US in New York for the vacant title. Then August 27th, 1925, Louis Kaplan draws over 15 rounds against Babe Herman from the US in Waterbury. Then December the 18th, 1925, Louis Kaplan wins on points over 15 rounds against Babe Herman. That was in New York. Then July 1927, Kaplan relinquishes the title because of weight problems. Then September the 19th, 1927, Benny Bass from Russia wins on points over 10 rounds against Red Chapman from the US in Philadelphia for the vacant NBA title. Then October the 27th, 1927, Tony Canzoneri wins on points over 15 rounds against Johnny Dundee in New York for the version of the vacant title. Then February the 10th, 1928, Tony Canzoneri wins on points over 15 rounds against Benny Bass, New York for the undisputed title. Then September 28th, 1928, Andre Routis from France wins on points over 15 rounds against Tony Canzoneri in New York. Then May 27th, 1929, Andre Routis from France wins in the 3rd round against Buster Brown from the US in Baltimore. Then September 23rd, 1929, Battling Battaglino from the US wins on points over 15 rounds against Andre Routis from France in Hartford, Connecticut. Then July the 15th, 1930, Battling Battaglino wins by KO in the 5th round against Ignacio Fernandez from the Philippines, Hartford, Connecticut. Then December the 12th, 1930, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 15 rounds against Kid Chocolate from Cuba. That was in New York. Then May 22nd, 1931, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 15 rounds against Fidel LaBarba from the US in New York. Just before that, Battaglino I might have missed a few here, so I'm going to go back just in case. So February the 15th, 1930, Battling Battaglino wins by KO in the 5th round against Ignacio Fernandez from the Philippines in Hartford, Connecticut. December the 12th, 1930, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 15 rounds against Kid Chocolate from Cuba in New York. Then May 22nd, 1931, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 15 rounds against Fidel LaBarba from the US, the Olympian LaBarba, and that was in New York. Then July 23rd, 1931, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 10 rounds against Freddie Miller from the US in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then November the 4th, 1931, Battling Battaglino wins on points over 10 rounds against El Mastro from the US in Chicago, Illinois. January 1932, the NBA and the New York Commissions declared the title vacant after Battaglino had been 3 pounds overweight for a scheduled defence against Freddie Miller. So when you go to the NBA title now, so May the 26th, 1932, Tommy Paul from the US wins on points over 15 rounds against Johnny Penner from Puerto Rico and Detroit, Michigan for the vacant title. Then, January 13th, 1933, Freddie Miller wins on points over 10 rounds against Tommy Paul in Chicago, Illinois. Then, February 28th, 1933, Freddie Miller wins on points over 10 rounds against Baby Arizmendi from Mexico, 10 rounds point decision. Again, started one of the youngest fighters, just very young when he started his pro career, Baby Arizmendi, as the name's coined, as in Los Angeles. March 21st, 1933, Freddie Miller wins on points over 10 rounds against Speedy Dado from Philippines in Los Angeles. Then July 11th, 1933, Freddie Miller wins in the 4th round by KO against Abi Israel from the US in Seattle, Washington. January the 1st, 1934, Freddie Miller wins on points over 10 rounds against Jackie Sharkey from the US in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then July 13th, 1934, Freddie Miller wins by KO in the 8th round against Gene Espinosa from the US in Watsonville. Then September 21st, 1934, Freddie Miller wins on points against Neil Tarleton from England. That was in Liverpool, England. And then February 17th, 1935, Freddie Miller wins by KO in the 1st round against Joe Girones from Spain in Barcelona, Spain. Then again he fights Tarleton. June the 12th, 1935, Freddie Miller wins on points over 15 rounds against Neil Tarleton. Yeah, he wins on 15 rounds over Neil Tarleton again. And that was in Liverpool, England. Then October 22nd, 1935, Freddie Miller wins on points over 15 rounds against Vernon Cormier from US in Boston, Massachusetts. Then February 18th, 1936, Freddie Miller wins on points over 12 rounds against John Penner. And that was in Seattle, Washington. Then May 11th, 1936, P.T. Saron wins on points over 15 rounds against Freddie Miller, Washington DC, 1936, the same year as the Berlin Olympics. But I digress. So, July 22nd, 1936, let's go back. May 11th, 1936, Peter Saron. I might have missed a few, so I'm going to go back just in case. So, March 2nd, 1936, Freddie Miller wins on points over 15 rounds against P.T. Saron in Miami, Florida. Then May 11th, 1936, P.T. Saron wins on points over 15 rounds against Freddie Miller in Washington, D.C. Then July 22nd, 1936, P.T. Saron wins on points over 15 rounds against Baby Manuel from the US in Dallas, Texas. Then September the 4th, 1937, P.T. Saron wins on points over 12 rounds against Freddie Miller in Johannesburg, South Africa. Then October 29th, 1937, Henry Armstrong and his freeweight reign here, nearly 4, from the US, wins by KO against P.T. Saron in New York for the NBA and New York State titles, which Armstrong relinquished in 1938. So we have December 29th, 1938, Leo Rodak from the US wins on points over 10 rounds against Leon Efrati from the US in Chicago, Illinois. Although this was an overweight match, the NBA agreed to recognise Rodak as the champion. Then April the 18th, 1939, Joey Archibald from the US wins on points over 15 rounds against Leo Rodak from Providence, Rhode Island, for the undisputed title. So, from here, I can go onto this page just to finish this one. So I'm going to turn the page. So I'm going to finish here. Last few. So we got the New York State Athletic title. October the 13th, 1932, Kid Chocolate wins in the 12th round. Referee stops the fight against Lou Feldman, the Jewish fighter from the US, in New York. Then, December the 9th, 1932, Kid Chocolate wins on points over 15 rounds against Fidel LaBarba from New York. That was in New York. Then May the 19th, 1933, Kid Chocolate wins on points over 15 rounds against Tommy Watson from England in New York. The New York Commission stripped Chocolate in May 1934 for failing to defend against Frankie Click. May 1936, New York State Commission recognised Mike Belois as the champion. So we're going to go the last one. September the 3rd, 1936, Mike Belois from the US wins by KO in the 9th round against Dave Crowley from England in New York. That's the end of the first of the featherweight division. Boxing title, history. Lovely. Bang.